Well, welcome. Welcome to our conference, and on behalf of Santa Clara University President, Father Michael Lang, I welcome all of you to the second day of the conference here called Our Future on a Shared Planet, Silicon Valley in Conversation with the Environmental Teachings of Pope Francis. We extend a warm welcome to all visiting our campus, and we, of course, warmly welcome all Santa Clara students, faculty, staff, alums, and affiliates. Pope Francis specifically addressed his groundbreaking encyclical, Laudato Si', not only to Catholics, but to all people of goodwill. Of course, that encyclical, which was issued in June, is the occasion for this conference and for this gathering of all of us, people of goodwill, to think through together how to respond to the great challenge of climate change and to our great obligation to care for our common home, the Earth. I'm David DeCoste, the Director of Campus Ethics Programs at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara, a Catholic theologian on our Religious Studies faculty, and the chair of the Faculty, Staff, and Student Organizing Committee that pulled together this conference. I'd like to take a moment to name the stellar members of that committee. Please say hello to them during the day. They are Tom Massaro, Ed Maurer, Iris Stewart-Frey, Bill Sundstrom, John Farnsworth, Ken Manister, Lindsay Kalkbrenner, Keith Warner, Pat Haynes, Blair Libby, and Sean Riley. Perhaps the largest committee ever put together to organize a conference, but they were wonderful, all of them. So, huge thanks to all of them, and also to Mike Nuttall and Susan Chun of the Ignatian Center here at Santa Clara. We have 4 great talks today, each structured to allow for discussion. There'll be a talk, a response, and then the balance of each hour-and-a-half session for discussion. We'll have microphones in the audience and invite you to take the mic and speak. Invite you also to be brief and to the point so we can get as many people in the mix as possible. We also have breaks designed to allow you to kind of get up and stretch your legs, to network around these important issues, or just to make a new friend. A few practical details: restrooms are on this side of the room. We have drinks in the back and food outside. Lunch will be provided at 11:30, although I want to note the talk by Mayor Liccardo is due to start at 12 p.m. Wi-Fi access is available to all. If you're outside the SCU community, you can get on at SCU Guest. There should be no password needed. You should just be able to get right on. Last note there, all unsolvable problems can go to Mike Nuttall and Susan Chun, who are here. So, okay, so about to start our first session with Professor Ramanathan from UC San Diego. The person introducing that session is Ed Maurer, the Robert Peters Professor of Civil Engineering in the School of Engineering here at Santa Clara and a member of our organizing committee for the conference. Professor Ramanathan's respondent today will be Professor Iris Stewart-Frey, the chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences here at Santa Clara University, and also a member of our organizing committee. Professor Maurer.
It's not too much to say that the work of Professor Ramanathan has in significant ways guided climate science in the past decades. How did we get ourselves into the climate change situation we're in, and how might we get ourselves out of it? Professor Ramanathan is surely among the most knowledgeable people in the world to help us with that. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric and climate sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California at San Diego, and the UNESCO professor of climate and policy at Terry University in Delhi, India. In his early work, he discovered the greenhouse effect of chlorofluorocarbons and numerous other human-made trace gases. And in 1980, he accurately forecast that the warming of climate due to rising CO2 levels would be detectable by 2000. In the 1990s, he was a leader in the effort that showed how widespread atmospheric brown clouds over South Asia were contributing to melting Himalayan glaciers, disrupted monsoons, and decreasing rice harvests in India. The chief culprit for all this, he found, was black carbon, or soot, a large part of which was generated by poor men and women through cooking with inefficient stoves. Recently, Professor Ramanathan has argued that the mitigation of what are called short-lived climate pollutants, like black carbon or methane, can slow down warming significantly. For this work and much else, he's earned global recognition. He's been since its inception, part of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The United Nations awarded him their top environmental award in 2013, and he's a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, among many other highly distinguished scientific academies. For many years as well, he's worked closely with the Vatican on climate change. Pope John Paul II named him to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Last July, he joined Mayor Liccardo, who we've heard will speak here at noon today, as well as Governor Jerry Brown and many others, at a conference at the Vatican on climate change and cities. We're deeply grateful to have him speak to us today on the topic of fighting climate change, a new alliance between science, religion, and policy. Professor Ramanathan.
Thank you, Professor Maurer, for that introduction. I'm, for many reasons, which will become obvious to you as I, give my talk today, that I'm delighted to be here. And particularly, the opening interfaith session we had is exactly the sort of coalition we need across faiths to really fight this defining battle over climate change. And as was mentioned, I've been working in this field for 40 years. In fact, my first paper was exactly 40 years ago. Since then, I published close to about 200 papers, and about 180 of them, I consider them to be mainly obituaries, bringing one bad news after the other. And it's about 10 years ago, I turned 60, so you can guess my age now. And I was doing a field experiment with aircraft in the middle of the Indian Ocean off of the Maldives. And I get this email, and the starting of that email was something about Pope John Paul. And what would you think? You're sitting in a tiny island looking at your computer. And the first sentence starts with Pope John Paul, so I assumed it was a spam email. And I was going to delete it. Fortunately, my curiosity got the better of me. And it was an invitation from the Holy Father inviting me to join the Pontifical Academy. It was 5 years into that, I realized there is a new force to fight climate change. And I knew the flaw on the approaches then, where we just thought science and policy can solve this problem. We know now, largely the problem has been unsolved. And in the meantime, we are rushing headlong into what I would think, and hopefully I can persuade you today, disastrous climate changes, a lot more severe, and a lot sooner than we think. And this is where I think it's the alliance between science and religion and policy is going to save us from this battle, and which if we don't win this battle, millions, if not billions, are going to suffer. Many of them, most of them, innocent bystanders. So with that introduction, I want to start off. You heard from Cardinal Turkson. I meet him often at the meetings of the Pontifical Academy. There is no way I can match his eloquence. I've seen different versions of this Laudato Si. My favorite is that section which talks about integral ecology. It's just an ingenious definition. Of course, it predates Pope Francis, from John Paul II time, and then Pope Benedict. Natural systems is basically the land we live, the forests, the atmosphere, the rivers, the ocean. Social systems are cities. We're going to hear a leader of a social system, mayor of Santa Clara today, right? Governments, institutions, etc. It's very interesting. Most, if not all, academic institutions treat these so separately. We are in different stovepipes, right? We think we can just study nature. That's what I did 40 years. And little did I know that we need to understand in a fundamental way the interaction between human systems and natural systems. And the solution lies in that. So it's ingenious that Pope Francis gave it a central role. So it says, demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and protecting nature. So what's the connection between poverty and nature? This is what I started studying when I joined the Pontifical Academy 10 years ago. So let's look at the natural systems. You will soon learn about the climate change, combustion, burning fossil fuels and climate change. But very few of us know. We immediately think of environmental issues, climate change, we think of population. Oh, the planet is going to 9 billion, so of course it's a problem. But the climate pollution is primarily from the top 1 billion, putting out 60% of the pollution, primarily from unsustainable consumption. My own take is it's not our standard of living which is the issue. It is the fact that we are trying to maintain our standard of living with outdated technologies. The most outdated technology is coal. Close by is oil, and close by is gas, okay? Let's look at the other side of the planet, the bottom 3 billion. The 3 billion poorest, primarily forced by poverty, to rely on 18th century technologies. Their contribution to the global warming pollution is just about 5%. These are the two I briefed Pope Francis in person after a meeting I'll talk to you later. And we know this 3 billion are primarily farmers, rural folks, living on what's called sustenance farming. They till the soil, they grow food that just lasts them for that year. A 5-year drought like what we are seeing in California would wipe them out of their livelihood, make the young people, boys and girls, into what Pope Francis calls socially excluded to slavery, etc., etc. Okay? So how do I hone in on this? I grew up in such a home. This photograph I took about 5 years ago. I was a paying guest in her hut. And my grandmother used to cook exactly like that. So, so let me just give you a little bit of my history. That was my grandmother's home. And we're not living there anymore, none of my family. I took this picture 5 years ago. I was exactly one of those topless kids sitting on that veranda on a hot summer. I used to spend my summers there. So why did this kid come to the US? There's only one reason: not to pursue higher studies, definitely not to work on environment or climate change. I wanted to buy this Impala car. And why did I settle on a car? My father was a tire salesman for Goodyear Tire, but sitting in remote India, he used to bring these brochures home. I got hooked. I came to the US to do my PhD in engineering, but the day I joined, as luck or fate would have it, my advisor got tired of engineering, switched to studying the atmospheres, primarily Mars and Venus. I did my thesis, and of course I couldn't get a job. I went back to India. My father listened to what I did, and he told me with a serious face, only America can afford to pay this sort of useless science to humanity. So I came back to the US. As luck would have it, I joined NASA. On my part-time, I started looking into this chlorofluorocarbons. It was in '74, two scientists linked these chlorofluorocarbons, which was used as refrigerants and propellants, and they said this would destroy the ozone layer. But I had studied, in my PhD was on quantum mechanics and studying the atmospheres. So I somewhat accidentally but discovered that the CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, were the most potent greenhouse gas. So much so, my work showed releasing a ton of these chlorofluorocarbons would have the same greenhouse effect as releasing 10 to 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which is the major greenhouse gas from fossil fuels. Of course, no one believed my work, but it appeared in the front page of New York Times the same day. And I was supposed to have been, it was written by the dean of science journalism called Walter Sullivan. Some of you may know him. I was supposed to be interviewed on the same day in Walter Cronkite's Evening News. But the reporter who interviewed me could not pronounce my name, and neither could I explain to him. I had just 4 years from that village in India, couldn't explain to him properly, so that show was never aired. But what it taught me, realized the potency of climate change, and the fact that we humans can fundamentally change the climate we live in. So it had one devastating impact on my ambition. I could never buy that Impala car again. I'll show you what the car I have now, but later. So how did I go from that to having a personal audience with Pope Francis on climate change? This was during the summit where our mayor of Santa Clara was there. I had invited Governor Jerry Brown to that summit. This was organized by the Pontifical Academy of Science. It's in that summit I came away, in fact, one of my happiest moments in my life. I said, we now have a solution to this problem. And I see Pope Francis, as of course he is the leader of the Catholic Church, but I view him as the moral leader of the planet. and he's, I feel, gone beyond his own faith. He appeals to everyone. So I want to track that story through the science first. So let's talk about this pollutant, carbon dioxide. The fuel we burn, whether it's grass you burn or trees or fossil fuel, it's basically what we call hydrocarbons, carbon and hydrogen attached together. And when you burn it, the carbon combines with the oxygen air to become carbon dioxide. It's colorless. You don't see it coming out of your tailpipes, but it's there. How much of this carbon dioxide we have released? Since Mr. James Watt invention of the steam engine, so-called ushering the fossil fuel era, it took us 220 years to dump 1 trillion tons. A trillion tons is 1,000 billion tons, okay? And a billion tons is 1,000 times million. So if you write the zeros, it'll fill the screen and go outside that room. So that's how much we have already emitted. And then it took us the next 40 years to emit the second trillion. And our best climate science, my own science is I don't rely on models, mainly from observations. When I was in NASA, I designed a satellite experiment to measure the greenhouse effect of the Earth. And then when I got this, what I think this most exciting email from Pope John Paul's office, I was launching unmanned aircraft. So I look at the atmosphere from experimentally. So each trillion ton commits the planet to about 3/4 of a degree Celsius warming. That's close to about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? It's actually 1 point, but you can just multiply by 2. So we already put enough gases to warm the planet by 1.5 degrees, or about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. We are emitting about 40 billion tons every year. At that rate, we are going to put the next trillion in 20 years. By the time, that's 2030, just 15 years from now, the third trillion would be up there. We already committed the planet at that stage to 2.25 degree warming. Most of us think a warming of 2 degrees would be disastrous. First for the ecosystems and then to humans, because we have not seen that warming in the last at least 2 million years. None of the living beings know that such a warm planet, okay? So that's what I meant. The problem has become imminent, urgent, a lot more serious. So how do we know? So what happens? Why am I claiming this stuff which comes out of your tailpipe is going to heat the planet? The problem is, once you release the carbon dioxide, let's say that you came in a bus or your own car, about 50% of everything that came out of your tailpipe stays there for 100 years. And about 25% stays there for 1,000 years. So what happens to this gas? It covers the planet like a blanket. Just like a blanket keeps you warm on a cold winter night by trapping your body heat, this blanket of carbon dioxide traps the heat which comes from Earth and the atmosphere, okay? So the fundamental source of the climate system, as much as life, is incoming sunlight. That sunlight heats the Earth and the air, and they give off this heat as infrared or heat radiation. It is that heat flow from the Earth via blanketing. Just like it's the heat flow from your body, which is blanketed by this blanket, otherwise you'd feel cold. So it's basic quantum mechanics, and it has been proved. I myself have launched a satellite with NASA to measure this directly. That is why it is so sad that about 140 million Americans don't believe in this. They think of it as poor science, flawed science. And that is where it's easy to blame those who don't believe in what we say as give names, conservatives, this, that. I honestly don't believe in that. We have not, as scientists, we have failed in communicating our predictions, okay? That is why now I come to you all. We need the help of religions, okay? And let's see what form. I'm first going to talk to you about this alliance between science and religion. Science and religion, then bring the policy next. So this was already talked about. You know, any theory has to be judged by the prediction. If it can't predict, then that theory cannot be trusted, if its prediction is not verified. Remember, Einstein's theory of relativity was trusted only after Eddington proved it with a famous experiment from Africa. Same way, I teamed up with a meteorologist, took the best data we had. This was 35 years ago, mind you. And we predicted, if this theory is right, the carbon dioxide warming effect should be detectable by year 2000. It is in 2000, 2001, where 1,000 scientists poured through all the records, warming records, and showed the planet has warmed statistically significantly to know that this is unusual, okay? So how much has the planet warmed? About 9/10 of a degree Celsius. So that's about, I'm doing my math, multiplying 0.9 by 0.1.8. It's about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's already warmed. There's not an iota of doubt on that magnitude of that warming, okay? The rest of it, remember I was predicting 1.5 degrees by now. So this is what persuaded 1,000 scientists to write their finding that the planet is warmed and that warming is primarily due to human activities. There are a number of things I can talk about climate change: droughts, fires, storms, etc., sea level rise. But the thing which most concerns me is the impact on human health. This is what very few have realized. So this report came out this year from one of the most prestigious medical journal, Lancet, a team of health experts. I just leave this statistics. They talk about that it could become one of the most serious threat to global health, 3 billion additional annual exposure to heat waves. It will threaten to undermine the last half century of development gains. We'll talk about that. And they basically say climate change is becoming a medical emergency. Okay, we already know how many, perish to floods, storms, heat waves, etc. So, now we can relax. I've given you all the bad news I want to give for today. So the obituaries is done. Let's talk about a new birth, okay? So I want to brief you a little bit about the Pontifical Academy of Science. Surprisingly to me, very few, even in the Christian community, knew about this academy. It's easily one of the most prestigious academy. Every nation has its own Academy of Science, and its members are 80. Many academies have 1,000. U.S. Academy has 2,000 members. About 1/3 of them are Nobel laureates. Okay, and it traces its origin to the Academia Lincei, formed in 1603. In that sense, it's one of the oldest academy, although it was discontinued and then reformed. It's truly international in scope, multiracial in composition, And what really surprised me when I joined was it's non-sectarian in its choice of members. Just to give you how little I knew about this, and on the time I was inducted personally by Pope John Paul, and I stayed in the Domus Santa Martha. That's where all the cardinals stay. That morning there was a service in St. Peter's Basilica, and I went down, and next to me was sitting on the bell laureate. I suddenly has this terror. Oh my God, I don't think the church knows I am not a Christian. So I told my Nobel laureate Paul, I said, Paul, there's a big mistake. I said, I'm not a Christian. And he was a good friend of mine. He said, oh, that means you have to leave. I was about to get up, and he said, no, this is a non-sectarian academy. Members are elected just for scientific excellence. So that is its strength. And we discuss all topics under the sun, including the issue of creationism, population, etc. It's just one of the most amazing. I belong to many academies, including the Swedish Academy of Science, which gives Nobel Prizes. But this Pontifical Academy is an exceptional institution in the topics it discusses. So one of the things we do is organize scientific meetings. In fact, this Saturday I'm leaving to go to Vatican for a major meeting. And I had proposed, along with this Paul Crutzen, that we should have a meeting on climate change on the mountain glaciers. And we had the top world's experts, glaciologists, climate scientists, et cetera, And that's where I realized one of our conclusion, every such meeting, we release a document, scientific evidence, the more thorough investigation of a problem. But our main conclusion in that meeting was, if we want justice and peace, we must protect the habitat that sustains us. So he talks about the social system and the human system and the idea of protection. Okay? To me, it was very powerful. So at the end of that meeting, we brief the Holy Father. This time it was Pope Benedict. And introducing me is Professor Kabibo. He was the president he's no more, of the academy. And after that meeting, we were encouraged by Pope Benedict to talk about sustainability. So I teamed up, there are two academies, natural science, social sciences. I teamed up with a famous economist, Professor Pratha Dasgupta. So we proposed this meeting. And so in fact, the title we gave the church was Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature. And the Vatican came back. Our chancellor is Chancellor Marcelo Sanchez Serrando, and the co-organizer was Archbishop Minerath. And the church added the last sentence, our responsibility. See, until then, it was almost at that stage, 39 years I've been in the field, we never thought of the problem as our responsibility. Okay? So at the end of this 3-day meeting, in fact, one of our speakers, Professor Gretchen Daly from Stanford, she was there too. She was one of the speakers. So I went to, we all marched to brief Pope Francis. And I was expecting, in this breathtaking hall within the Basilica, this is, of course, Pope John Paul. So I was imagining this room, and so we were waiting here. That's what you see, the building in front of me is Domus Santa Martha. On the second floor is where Pope Francis stays. We all are in the 3rd and 4th floor. So I was waiting in the parking lot, expecting to get into the Basilica in this breathtaking room. And I don't know if Gretchen realized this. Suddenly I saw someone getting out of a small car. I think it was a Ford something. And Pope Francis was right in front of us, beaming his smile. And I didn't know what to do because I was expecting about 10 minutes to brief Pope Francis. And Marcella Serndo, the chancellor, who was standing next to Pope Francis, said, "Ram, you have to brief the Pope in 2 sentences. He has to go somewhere." So the 2 sentences I briefed Pope Francis was, first is, we are all here world's experts. We are concerned about climate change. And the second sentence I said was what I had talked about, is that there are poor as 3 billion who had very little to do with this, who are going to suffer the worst consequences. So it's a huge moral, ethical issue for us. And then Pope Francis said something in Spanish, and Marcelo translated. He said, "The Holy Father is asking, what can he do about it?" My third sentence to him that when you preach, please mention to people to be good stewards of the planet. And it was when I was walking back, I realized I had told the church what it's been doing for the last centuries about asking people to be good stewards. I was a little bit embarrassed about that. But anyway, I now call this my parking lot pitch, like an elevator speech. So at the end of that, based on all the presentations, Dasgupta and I had summarized that meeting. This was, mind you, many Nobel laureates and professors from famous institutions like Stanford. But what we concluded was remarkably atypical for a scientific meeting. We said fundamentally, solution to this problem requires change in attitude towards nature and towards each other. And therefore, it requires moral leadership. What that means is that as scientists, we don't have that authority to preach morality. I doubt very much even if political leaders have that authority. But the faith leaders have. Okay? And in fact, there was a session in which we said how lucky we are to have Pope Francis as a moral leader at this crucial moment. So what we concluded there is this transformational step may well be a massive mobilization of public opinion by the Vatican and other religions, okay, for collective action to safeguard the well-being of both humanity and the environment. It is in that context I want to congratulate Santa Clara University for having this interfaith session this morning. This is exactly what we need, because this is not a problem of one particular religion or one particular faith. It's a problem we all have to work together. So then the following fall, okay, we had a meeting. The Academy, this is where we hold our meeting, the Pontifical Academy of Science. It's the best setting for discussion of profound topics in an informal way. So this was about concepts of nature, evolution particularly. I was there in that meeting, Pope Francis, he addressed us for almost 40 minutes that evening. He made his famous statement, God is not a magician. He talked about how science and religion are not, competition with each other. So then came the April 28th summit. By then, we had, the Laudato Si was being planned, was going to be released. The Academy saw the power of science and policy working with religion together. So teaming up with Jeff Sachs from Columbia University, he's sitting next to me, we organized this meeting. Of course, the power and the brain behind this is sitting behind me, Chancellor Marcelo Sanchez-Serrando. He's the Chancellor of the Academy, Monsignor by title, just a remarkable person. You can see 2 seats after Marcelo is Cardinal Turkson. So we invited Ban Ki-moon. He had a personal audience with the Pope. And what we declared there, human-induced climate change is a scientific reality. No if, no but it's a reality. Okay, recognizing science moves. And the second is, its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. And now we can, many leaders have embraced this. And we said in this core moral space, the world's religions play a very vital role. After all, as we heard this morning, all religions say the same about protecting nature. So there is this issue of environment and climate change where science, religion, and policy all want the same, protection of nature. So then came the most decisive, this is, at the end of that meeting, this is our declaration. This is mainly the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And so, for example, Y.T. Lee is a Nobel laureate in chemistry, Maria Molina is a Nobel laureate, Paul Crutzen, and Martin Rees was the president of the Royal Society of England. So it has truly the scientific authority to make such statements. What it talked about is the underlying problem was one of economics. It says our current economic obsession, I more think of it as worshiping GDP above everything else, which the economist says, okay, if natural capital were of infinite size, our air can have taken all the abuse, our forests can take all the burning. We know it's not the case. To the extent that natural capital is limited, GDP by itself is going to take us in the path we are on, unsustainable path. So then came, finally, the meeting in my mind, which cemented this alliance between science, religion, and policy. This was the Mayor's Summit. I'm not going to say much about this, just a few words. My feeling is we would hear from our mayor today. And the world's major city mayors were mega cities as well as smaller cities, because of the belief by our Pope and the Church that the cities have to serve as living laboratories. See, our academy has already concluded by then, if you rely on this top-down approach, which is the United Nations trying to persuade 140 countries to sign a piece of paper, is important, but we can't rely on that. The problem is so urgent, we need actions from the bottom, okay? So that was the spirit of that meeting. It was convened in a larger hall. You can see our Governor Jerry Brown sitting on the second. And we remember it tied climate change to slavery. Why slavery? Remember with the Syrian refugee crisis, we are talking about 1 million. And you see how poor the world is equipped to handle that. We are expecting, with sea level rise, storms and floods, this century we can see few 100 million refugees, okay? So we heard the second speaker was this girl originally from Philippines. She was trafficked when she was 12 years. And she finally got out when she was 24. And she got out because she was severely beaten. You could still see the scars on her body. She gave such a stirring speech. And you can see I'm sitting there with really worried look. First was, I see a parallel between what's happening to this girl. Her only fault was being born poor. What, as human beings, in this case men, can do, inflict pain. And I saw a similarity between that and what we are doing to nature. The other reason I was worried was her speech was so stirring. I said, how can I ever match that? I was following her after that. Anyway, after that meeting, we declared the effective control of human-induced climate change should be bolstered. You can see by now, Pope Francis has taken it as his war, his fight. And we talked about, through new incentives for the transition towards low-carbon renewable energy. And then the second, this was added by the church, through the relentless pursuit of peace, which also will enable a shift of public financing from military spending. So profound. I'll tell you about the cost of this to fight this climate change. You can see the first signatory is Papa Francisco. And we can see our own Jerry Brown, fourth signature from the top on the left-hand side. So that was to me, and then of course, Pope Francis came to the US. You all heard about the eloquent speeches he made. Now I want to switch to talking about how do we take this forward? 5 minutes, good. So, at the University of California, we met 50 of us and came with the top 10 solutions for bending the curve. Okay? So it was just released early this week, Tuesday, in fact. So what is the curve we are trying to bend? You see on the top one, red one, that is where everything is going up. Our temperatures are shooting up. Our emissions of carbon and numerous pollutants. And if you let it go, by end of the century, that warming is going to be close to 4 degrees, give or take 50%. And so there's a 10% probability the warming could be as large as 6 degrees. To find that kind of a planet, we have to go back 60 million years when the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth. Okay? So what is hope here is California can serve as the beacon. Why is that? The University of California system has our President Janet Napolitano last year declared the entire 10-campus system with a population of 500,000 would go carbon neutral. Our generation of power, heat, everything would be carbon neutral with renewables. Okay? So the UC system is going to serve as living laboratory for the planet. And the state of California is already on an aggressive path. As you know, Jerry Brown this February announced our carbon emissions would go down by 50% by 2050. Okay? So which means this entire state, its cities, and the university would become living laboratories for the rest of the planet. So what are our top 10 solutions? We put under five categories. First is science. See, I talked about carbon dioxide. Remember my work on fluorocarbons? That led to discovery of 4 other pollutants which are causing 40% of the warming. The good news about those is that their lifetime is just only a few weeks to 10 years. So if you cut them down, they're gone 2 weeks from now. California cut its black carbon pollution by 50% in just 20 years. We just have to export that knowledge and technology. So what we said is to bend that curve, first you push it from the top by cutting down these 4 short-lived climate pollutants. Within 30 years, we will see the climate cooling by 0.6 of a degree. About 50% of the warming would be taken away. So that curve would go down. And then you pull the carbon dioxide by switching to renewables. This is where the California experience is a message of hope to the world. But that was our solution 1. Our solution 2 and 3 is that this requires fundamental social transformation. Okay? And you ask, why is social transformation important? We have left behind 140 million Americans just in the US. This problem unfortunately became political. Climate change is not a political problem. So how do we do that? That is where we talk about in this document. I brought 4 copies of the document. I'll leave it here. If you want more, I can distribute it. Is that this has to be taught in every church, every mosque, every synagogue, every temple. Okay? And how do we do that? Universities like Santa Clara, UC system, I'm pleased to say all 50 academics have signed on to that. We got to work at a local level. We've tried the global level. We've gone some far, but it's not working. Okay? And it's only when they hear science, religion, policy coming together at their local place of worship, they would know this is not a political issue. Third and fourth and fifth are dealing with governance, subnational governance, going from cities. Santa Clara, San Diego is going to go carbon neutral in 2035. What does that tell you? This is not a pie in the sky. It's already there. The technology is there. It's a question of being willing to do it. Okay? So on and so forth. So I'm running out of time. And so I'm going to go to my last slide. You can see how many I skipped. David already warned me, it's too many. So I want to conclude this. This is honestly one of the most exciting sentences. I think this is attributed by Pope Francis to Saint Assisi. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between, the he refers to Assisi, Saint Assisi. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, you saw that, 1 billion and 3 billion, commitment to society and interior peace. Okay? I just quote one from the Veda, this is from the Hindu religion, 1000 BC. O Mother Earth, ocean-girdled, mountain-breasted, forgive me for trampling on thee. Thank you.
Our response will be given by Professor Iris Stewart-Frey, the chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences at Santa Clara University.
Dear Professor Ramanathan, thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. Dear members of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and SCU communities, thank you for being here and being a part of our dialogue today. The encyclical and the presentation we just heard strike a chord here at Santa Clara University for many reasons. They are based on state-of-the-art scientific investigation. They emphasize the moral dimensions and especially the moral responsibility of the so-called first world, and they are asking us, all of us, to heed a call to action. Through my role as a responder, I was asked to reflect on your comments, Ram, through a Santa Clara lens. A Santa Clara lens that puts into focus the collective commitment of the university, its students, staff, and faculty to working towards a more just, humane, and sustainable world, and a growing awareness of our use of resources. Through the Office of Sustainability, in partnership with the wider campus community, our commitment includes residential laboratories on sustainable living here on campus, a climate neutrality action plan for the university, systematic efforts at responsible consumerism and waste diversion, green building design, water conservation, and the extensive use of recycled water, and the inclusion of dimensions and sustainability in much of our teaching and learning. Yesterday, we heard about the many ways the Miller Center connects the campus community to marginalized communities worldwide through appropriate technologies and social entrepreneurship. Yes, in many ways, the Santa Clara community is at the forefront of helping to bend the curve. A Santa Clara lens also involves the research being conducted here on campus. Research like the Sustainable Energy Initiative in the School of Engineering that aims at furthering the technology conversion. Research that started with solar panels on a Santa Clara building 50 years ago and is now focused on such cutting-edge work as the economics of solar PV in the residential market and the development of a carbon credit meter. Santa Clara research is also investigating how the climatic changes already underway are affecting the water cycle and water resources, and how those with the least means are bearing the brunt of the burden. The effects of warmer temperatures on the water cycle are widely acknowledged to be among the most serious issues confronting humanity. Warmer temperatures increase evaporation rates and thus alter atmospheric water, clouds, precipitation patterns, and stream flow. Warmer temperatures also dry soils, melt glaciers, and cause precipitation that historically came as snow to fall as rain. The combination of these processes means that now and in the future, we can rely less on the historic availability of precipitation and have to contend with floods and droughts that we have not experienced before. In California, recent studies have found that climatic changes are already influencing the frequency, magnitude, and duration of these droughts. Even if there are no precipitation changes, the co-occurrence of dry years with warmer temperatures magnify drought conditions through greater demand and less supply. Thus, here in California, where a few winter storms are responsible for much of our water supply, we could very well see floods and drought in the same year. Even without climatic changes, we have altered our water supplies around the globe, and in many cases, irreversibly so. Groundwater resources that have accumulated over decades, centuries, and millennia have been mined to the point where water tables have taken a free fall and aquifers have permanently compacted. Loose or non-existent regulation and monitoring continues to make this tragedy of the commons possible. Increasingly, farmers and communities are sitting on dry wells. We only need to look as far as the Santa Clara Valley and the Central Valley for examples, but it is a story that is repeated worldwide. Around the globe, we have dammed and altered the flow and natural functioning of rivers, draining wetlands, one of the great sources of biodiversity, starving floodplains that bring nutrients to the surrounding areas, and storing and diverting much of the water in reservoirs to supply water-hungry cities and fields. As a human family, we have also drained and altered the hydrology of even the largest of lakes, like the Aral Sea and Lake Victoria, and what is left of them is choking under the constant input of fertilizers, salts, and agricultural chemicals. Ground and surface water sources have been greatly impacted by our collective industrial, mining, and agricultural activities. Many communities must rely on these compromised water sources and suffer the health consequences. Here in Silicon Valley, the legacies of chip manufacturing are still in our subsurface water. They are the obvious examples of acid mine drainage leaching into the water supplies of remote Andean communities, and they are the more subtle issues of pharmaceutical residues permeating water sources everywhere. And although the UN now has explicitly recognized a human right to clean drinking water and sanitation, for many communities, this goal is increasingly elusive, even without climatic changes. Clearly, our mindset, policies, scientific investigations, and market-based incentives have not been sufficient to protect from ourselves the fabric of the natural world that sustains us. And yes, many have pointed out to the environmentalists that people are tired of hearing these doomsday messages. Amid this continued exploitation, injustice, gridlock, and indifference, Pope Francis' encyclical letter Laudato Si has been transformational and a game changer. He's asking us to stand these realities and use the failure of our ability to address them as an impetus for a path forward. In his letter, the Holy Father calls for an ecological conversion of all of our humanity and for a shift in consciousness from being the masters of the earth, entitled to plunder her at will, to one of caring and caretaking, to one of a renewed understanding at the core of our beings that it is Mother Earth who sustains us and who we are part of. He's appealing to us not only for a change in technology, but a change in humanity. The encyclical is a plea to truly hear, understand, and relieve the sufferings of the poor. Pope Francis calls on us to question a rampant consumer mentality where life is getting increasingly faster and everything has its price, and instead invites us to reconnect with humanity, with ourselves, with the earth, and on a spiritual level inherent in all. That spiritual connection is not necessarily Catholic, and that spiritual connection is in harmony with the concepts and understandings of science and for scientists. In this context, a sentence from the encyclical had a particular resonance with me as a scientist and as a hydrologist. The external deserts of the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. Dear Ram, as someone who has provided your scientific expertise to the Holy Father, you point out that a sustainable relationship with nature requires scientific and moral leadership, and in your work you have outlined a clear path forward. When we put our multidisciplinary heads together, powerful synergies evolve. To achieve these synergies, we must use rigor, empathy, and imagination. There are increasingly more of us that must share shrinking resources, and we cannot remove ourselves from the ethical questions that implies. Climate, energy, and water are intricately linked to each other and to questions of justice and our humanity, and we must explore these linkages with our heads, our hearts, and our souls to chart the course towards a more sustainable world. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Well, we have time for questions and comments from all of you. There should be a couple of handheld microphones. Who has got? Oh, so we have one here and one over here. Okay, so please, if you have a question, if you could please just be brief and to the point, that would be great. So.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Ramanathan. My question is that I sense that in many cases the Catholic churches at the local level don't have a practice of, in a sense, this kind of activism, of taking that leadership and guiding people in really taking steps. There's kind of a raising of awareness that happens at Mass, but that few take a more active approach to helping people take those steps. Has there been any discussion of how to help them acquire those skills or that will?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very perceptive question. Where I see that activist role already there is at the very top level of faith leaders. Of course, Pope Francis is a stellar example, but we also have other leaders like the Dalai Lama and, Bartholomew and few others I've heard gave stirring speeches on environment. It's not only stirring speeches, very perceptible speeches. They know that actions have to be taken. So the question I think we need to collectively explore is how do you go from there to be done at an individual, local, church level. Okay? So in our 10 solutions, we felt that because it was written, also we had several ethicists, sociologists teaming up with us, that we felt the places to start would exactly be places like this, where faculty here, and certainly at San Diego, we are going to try to do that, work with our local churches, is to have small community level meetings to figure out how exactly to do that. I think the first piece of information is not even taking an activism role, just to impart that knowledge at a level which could be reached to, people. And we scientists, we don't know how to do that. Our language is a formidable barrier. This speech took me about 4 days to prepare, to whittle down all the jargon. Even then, I don't know if I succeeded. So that issue has, my feeling is, whatever preaching done at the individual church or synagogue or temple has to be scientifically also uncompromising. That's when, we'll have the impact we need. So we think it requires a consortia or an alliance between academics, policymakers, city civic leaders, and faith leaders. It's not there, I agree with you, but we have to start on that.
Thank you. Yes, sir, in the middle here.
Hello, my name is Sudhanshu Jan. I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby. And Professor Ramanathan, you mentioned that we're trying to maintain a standard of living with outdated technologies, like the first of which is coal. But we have governments like India and China saying they have to burn coal because of the poor people. And yet it's the 3 billion poorest people that are going to be affected by the pollution from coal and these outdated technologies and climate change. So how do you reconcile what the governments of India and China are saying with the fact that these poor people are going to be the most affected?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, just today we learned from an article in New York Times, the Chinese emission of coal was much larger than what even the Chinese thought. It is a misconceived perception that going green or going to renewable would destroy the economy, would destroy jobs, etc., etc. California has proved that to be totally wrong. Just from 2000 to now, our population grew by few millions. Our GDP grew by about 8%, but our greenhouse consumption came down by about 13%. So the technologies are there. Okay? Just to give you, a few examples, our California's consumption of power is 23% solar. And we just made an agreement to go 50% solar. And the cost of power generation by solar has now come down to about 7 cents, compared with coal, which is 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So now let's take that. You can ask, wait a minute, California is the most sophisticated, the richest state. We are the 8th largest economy in the world. how do you transport it to a place like India and China? Interestingly, energy economists have written papers to show solar is more affordable in Indian villages than in Silicon Valley for the simple reason they don't have any infrastructure. To convert our stuff into solar, we have to destroy our current infrastructure or decommission them and go to new ones. Indian villages, and same thing in Africa, they have no access to electricity. That's why they're burning firewood and dung. It's not because they are intentionally trying to clear out forests. And the women work hours collecting the wood and cooking, etc., etc. So solar would work a lot more efficiently in the villages. But of course, the problem with solar, just like you and I have in switching our house to solar, is the capital cost. And I wanted to mention to you there, that's something I skipped, is that right now our fossil fuel subsidy is $540 billion pre-tax. And by the time you bring in the damages of fossil fuel in terms of health, it kills 7 million every year. The true cost of fossil fuel is $4.5 trillion a year. To convert the entire world infrastructure to renewables, solar, wind, and hydro, it's about $1 trillion, 1/4 of the subsidy given to fossil fuel. So the money is there. It's a question of distribution, governance. So I personally don't buy the argument that coal is the cheapest way to go. This is where the nations working together and California taking its example to the world, that this is a solvable problem, could have a transformational impact.
Iris?
Yeah, Professor Ramanathan, you make the salient point that it's the top billion that's generating 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But yet, it is in the developing world that we're expecting to add the most people. And although they may not be part of that 60% of greenhouse gas emissions, they are likely to experience a greater amount of human suffering because of the general shortage of resources. What is, from your sense, the current thinking of the Vatican on that issue?
Yeah, I think if we read the Laudato Si and my own interaction with the church officials, they have no problems with that. In a sense, they knew all along the poor are going to be the worst affected by that. But I just want to make a point. I'm not trying to finger point the top 1 billion. To me, that's a good news because it's this 1 billion who are most connected. So it should be much easier to reach out to them to solve this problem than trying to link with the entire world population. So how do we do that? That is where I talk about this alliance between religion and science and policy. If you just take the American experience, about 55% already know climate change is happening and we should take action. It's the other 45% we need to reach out to. But the other thing I want to point out is this 1 billion, they live everywhere. China alone has about 200 of this 1 billion. India, about 40, 50 million. So to me, it becomes a collective responsibility and makes it easier to point out our moral responsibility as opposed to talking about nations. Then we get into this gridlock. And so that's basically what I need to point out. But in terms of the future population, what I forgot to point out is that our consumption and greenhouse gas emission is going to increase by 30% in the next 30 years, and that's what we want to cut down. 2/3 of that increase is coming from this 1 billion. Another billion we're going to add, most of them are still in the bottom 3 billion. So that's where I talk about this unsustainable consumption by the top 1 billion. That, to me, is the most hopeful sign. We should be able to reach out to the top 1 billion and point out it's a solvable problem. In fact, the cost to each one of them to go completely renewable is about $400 a person. I'm not saying that it's a small amount, but it's not an earth-shattering amount either.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ming Liang. Dr. Ramanathan, thank you for your work for the past 40 years and dedication. My question is...
Sir, could you hold the mic a little closer, please?
Okay. My question is more basic. I'm wondering if you can point me to studies where there is experimental proof that carbon dioxide is the cause. There's been a lot of such studies of association, and association is not cause.
Correct.
So would appreciate if you can point if there's any such studies.
Good point. In fact, I'm so glad you asked that. That's a fundamental source of this so-called controversy. That proof can be shown and has been done at many levels. First is, this is how physicists have shown this about 80 years ago, is that you take a tube of gas and shine light on one side and fill that with CO2 and see how much energy is trapped. And then what they do is slowly increase the amount of carbon dioxide in that small tube, and you see the energy trapped increases logarithmically with the carbon dioxide concentration. Okay, number one. And number two, this was done recently. We have what's called radiometers. Things measure the heat radiation of the surface. And scientists have looked at it over the last 20 years and have shown how the absorption increases as the carbon dioxide concentration has increased. Second proof. And the third is the carbon dioxide, remember I said covers like a blanket. What that means scientifically is whether you stick your carbon dioxide instrument in Santa Clara, or you stick it in the Arctic or Antarctic, you see carbon dioxide concentration has increased. And we know exactly how much has increased, 40%. Okay? And I personally, my own work is, we designed an infrared instrument, camera type instrument, but calibrated in space. And we look at that amount of heat escaping from the planet, and we have made measurements at the ocean surface. So looking at the difference of the two, we know how much energy is trapped. So this is as far as the blanket effect of trapping heat. And the second set of evidence is how has Mother Nature responded to that additional heating? Okay? And so we have thermometers around the surface which shows the planet has warmed, but that's not enough for us. For the theory to be right, this is what I defined in 1980, 4 things have to happen. The surface has to warm, the entire atmosphere, first 10 miles of the atmosphere has to warm, number 2. Number 3, the heat has to penetrate to depths of the ocean up to 1 kilometer, minimum. And this is what my institution has done, instruments which go down to the ocean, measure the temperature along the depth. So we see the entire column of the ocean has warmed over the last 100 years. And the fourth, which is highly technical, carbon dioxide, while it heats the atmosphere and surface, has to cool the upper atmosphere. We pointed that this is one of the fingerprinting techniques. So we see the upper atmosphere, called stratosphere, above 10 miles, has cooled steadily over the last 100 years. There is a number of these, all experimental, nothing to do with modeling, is what we use to convince ourselves that this is necessary and sufficient proof that this carbon dioxide we have released is the main source of the warming we have observed.
Thank you. Let's go back. Professor Bacon here, please.
Thank you so much for a powerful talk and a thoughtful response. My question is, seems like we've been talking a lot about the need for mitigation strategies while recognizing that climate change is happening now, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about investments in adaptation, particularly given the justice effects and the conditions of the most vulnerable, and also some thoughts about binding commitments on the upcoming Paris talks, particularly in terms of funding adaptation measures.
Yeah. I mean, excellent question. Even if we apply the best technologies and the best innovations, we have already put this 2 trillion, and we're going to add some more. We're 50% certain the planet is going to warm up to 2 degrees. We've already seen about half of that. So the question is, what are we doing about that? For example, by the time we warm by 2 degrees, our sea level could go up by 1 meter to 2. Just to talk to you about locally, there's a huge uncertainty, but if the sea level reaches 2 meters, and with storm surges, this airport, San Francisco Airport and San Jose Airport, we may have to move them inland. So adjustments have to be made at many levels. And we expect more mega droughts in the tropics, so it's not clear. We're going to add 7 to close to 9 billion by 2050. We're expecting about 60 to 70% would live in cities. That still leaves about 3 billion in rural areas. And how are we going to protect their livelihood, at the same time take care of damages to our own infrastructure? So it's a huge issue. You need to give me another 45 minutes to talk about adaptation. Thank you for asking. It's, I find generally our society and our leaders are completely ill-prepared for the type of massive changes we scientists are talking about. So it's not clear to me where that finance for adaptation is going to come from.
Iris, anything? Okay, we have a question here way up in the front, actually, and this will be our final question of this session.
Hi, my name's Katie Diggs. I'm a student here. And Dr. Ramanathan, I was wondering, do you believe divestment of fossil fuels at institutions like universities is a necessary or effective step in reducing our impact on the climate?
Can you complete the last sentence again? Yeah.
I was wondering if you believe divestment of fossil fuels at institutions like universities is a necessary step and effective step in reducing our impact on the climate.
I'm glad we are hearing what I call the voices of the future. That if your generation doesn't make sure we solve the problem we created, you're going to end up dealing with it. So as far as divestment of the fossil fuel, it's certainly, by universities, it certainly would be a major symbolic step. I'm not of an economist to know, to tell you with some certainty, what impact it would have in persuading fossil fuels companies to switch. Remember what's happening with the tobacco industry. They're still thriving. So I think depending on how much students your generation can bring into the problem, I feel the most impactful step for you would be to get educated and transfer that knowledge to your neighbors, to your relatives. We'll have a much bigger impact because this has to be a collective action. And as far as fossil fuel companies, the reason I'm not overly depressed about this is that in about the next 10 to 15 years, we are predicting such massive changes that there won't be many doubters left. And there will be a huge cry for action, but my hope is we don't wait that long because we're going to put the next trillion in the next 20 years. So certainly universities want to divest fossil fuel. It would be a major symbolic step. But I think we have run out of time for such symbolism. We need to take proactive actions to switch to renewable. Then who cares who divests what? Those fossil fuel companies would become fossilized. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Ramanathan. So there are refreshments in the back and outside over here. We're going to take a half-hour break, and then actually lunch will be provided at 11:30, and Mayor Liccardo is due at noon. So please mingle and meet new friends.